Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. So currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the town of Longmeadow, Mass. So, what is the history of Longmeadow?
Longmeadow, Massachusetts is a very nice place. It's rather small geographically because it lost its eastern section when East Longmeadow, Massachusetts was formed, I think, in 1884. So it used to be much bigger. It broke off of Springfield itself fairly early on. And of course, when you do that, you need a meeting house, which is a Protestant church or the Congregational church usually. And you also need cemetery and schools. And it did that. And so today we're going to talk about the neighborhoods of Longmeadow and why they formed, and what the Olmsted brothers did for Longmeadow. And also we're going to talk about how it preserves its history for itself. But of course it has a lot to offer for itself. You do get the sense of a meadow only when you go to the edge of the Connecticut River, and you can see the meadow, especially towards the south part of the Connecticut River along Longmeadow, where it meets Connecticut State itself. And so the history of Longmeadow is intertwined very much with its cemetery and its old first church. Those were made in the beginning. The first church actually was out on the green itself, and the green is still there. It's now with memorial stones to honor all the war dead from Longmeadow themselves, and the church used to be out there. And when they built a new one, they built it on the side of the street instead of in the middle of the green. And that was where the cemetery was. So the cemetery now had a church very close by, and most churchyard cemeteries are always very close to their church anyways. So it has a very nice look. It has a very ancient look, and that cemetery is about 300 years old now. And I hopefully will give a tour in there and talk about the gravestones and the old pioneers and the Holden tomb that's now there, and why the graves are positioned the way they are. So there's a lot to talk about in Longmeadow.
And what is the structure of the neighborhoods in Longmeadow?
Right, they're structured because the trolley used to go from Springfield along Longmeadow Street in Longmeadow into Connecticut and travel all the way to Hartford, Connecticut. So from Springfield to Hartford, it was about a 30-minute trip on the trolley. And so Longmeadow would have the trolley go through it along that north-south route for itself. And so what happened along the way is that from about 1900 to 1930, the trolley days themselves, you start to have neighborhoods build up. And these neighborhoods built up right along Longmeadow Street where the trolley was running. And so thus people would want to build their houses as close to Longmeadow Street as possible. And usually as close to Springfield as possible, because their jobs were in Springfield, even though they would take up residence in Longmeadow. So people played it smart, and they developed neighborhoods very close to the Springfield border, very close to Longmeadow Street, right? And a lot of the beautiful homes from the 1900s into the 1930s were built out there. And a lot of neighborhoods have very, very similar homes on them, like Colonial Revival homes, Victorian homes, Craftsman-style homes, bungalows, and they they repeat over and over again that style. So there's many hundreds of homes were built for the same reason in these neighborhoods. And I've done drive-through tours of each one of them, so you get a look at what they look like. And I'll build up that section very much with pictures and descriptions in the future.
And really quick, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And also, if you'd like to have any other inquiries or sign up for private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, @yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what is the Olmsted influence on Longmeadow?
All right, the Olmsteds developed two different neighborhoods, specifically within Longmeadow, and then it also developed the neighborhood that was right around the golf course, Arding Glen. And it developed the two neighborhoods in the beginning right up against Springfield. And those neighborhoods have the typical curved roads that the Olmsted loves to develop, and also different setbacks on the homes throughout the neighborhood. So it looked different for each house. And also it had very gradual uphills. So not only was it curving on the surface of the terrain, but also was going up and down on the terrains in very typical Olmstedian fashion. And they also developed a couple of the home landscapes. And so two of the homes have very gorgeous landscapes made by the Olmsted brothers themselves. Now, most of their work in Longmeadow, I believe, was done in late 19-teens and very early 1920s. And it's done a great job. And those houses I'm going to highlight at some point, and those neighborhoods I'll highlight at some point with a given specific tour so that people can see what kind of work they did. They also developed a plan for a park in the middle of Longmeadow. Now, be careful here because they designed the plans, but when Longmeadow went to implement them, they didn't implement them at all fully, not even half. And so Bliss Park, for instance, is one of those parks, and it's not developed according to the plans that the Olmsted brothers came up with. And so you're not going to say, oh, this is an Olmsted Park. No, it's much short of that because the plans were not fully realized.
And does Longmeadow preserve its history?
Yes, a lot of the old homes are preserved very well, especially around the Longmeadow Green area. And of course, the cemetery is in gorgeous shape. The Congregational Church, the first church, is in fine shape with its rectory also like that. And a lot of the Olmstedian neighborhoods and also a lot of these trolley neighborhoods I've talked about are in wonderful shape. And they're fun to walk down and look at the different style of homes that were built and why they might have been built. And I'm definitely going to build up this section. And of course, by the golf course, that Olmstedian neighborhood is probably the best example within Longmeadow of their work, and that is preserved to a very high degree. And I hear the Longmeadow Historic Society is very active, and other components around town are very active to help preserve their wonderful history.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for joining us. And if you want to check out a large selection of his other podcasts, you can do so on his website. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life is Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the Longmeadow Cemetery, located in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. So tell us about the history of the Longmeadow Cemetery.
Alright, the cemetery is the only cemetery in Longmeadow as Longmeadow is defined nowadays. There used to be more because Longmeadow, I believe 1882, included also East Longmeadow, which itself has 5 cemeteries. So this is the only one left. It is filled with a lot of the pioneers from Longmeadow, that's for sure. Now, it has a nice arrangement. The church, the First Longmeadow Church of Christ, is right next to the cemetery. It didn't start off that way. The church used to be on the green. So we'll talk about the history of that church too. And we're going to tell you along the way some of the people buried in here, and also about the tomb that's inside of here. Alright, so this cemetery is thought to have been started in 1716. That's before there was even a Longmeadow, when Longmeadow belonged to Springfield. And some of the people that settled in this area started up a cemetery. And that's one of the things you do need when you start up a community. Get your cemetery and a meeting house going and so forth. Alright, now, there is a nice arrangement within the cemetery where the stones are on the east-west axis like they should have. And that's great to see because that's the way they were put out there in the very beginning. Most of them would have been put along the axis in order to keep the tradition going of the body and the torso being positioned from east to west. And that's done here.
And tell us about the First Longmeadow Church of Christ.
Okay, this beautiful church started out on the green itself. Now, the very first meeting house church in Longmeadow was out at that green. And that one was made in 1716. And they kept that in use up to 1769. But they realized it was way too small. And so what they did in 1768, they built a new one. Now notice that I said the other one was used up to 1769, and the new one came around 1768. That means they overlapped in time. They didn't want to shut down the smaller, older one until the newer, medium-sized one was actually ready. Okay, now that was out on the green itself, and there happens to be a memorial square out in the green that's very close to where the former church was. Now, this First Church of Christ was moved from that green, and it was moved to the present location. That was in 1874. Okay, and at that point, you had then the cemetery and the church very close together. And that's the very typical arrangement. You would usually have the cemetery right touching the church. That's a church or a cemetery. And before, it was more like 200 feet away, which is a little atypical. Usually they're right on top of each other. Okay, and the rectory and the community house were built afterwards, and they're still up nearby. So you have a very nice arrangement of the church, rectory, so forth. So with the cemetery right along William Street, it's a great sight to see that former old church is right on top of it. And when you're walking through the cemetery, you're reminded of how throughout New England, every community would have such an arrangement going.
And really quick before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information or sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, tell us about Stephen Williams, who is buried in the Longmeadow Cemetery.
Okay, this is one of the most important persons in the history of Longmeadow itself. He was born in 1693 up in Deerfield. And yes, when Deerfield was raided by the Native Americans, he was, I believe he was one of the captives. And at some point he was released. Now, in 1714, the Green was being formed in Longmeadow. Houses were being built. A new church was being built. The cemetery was going to be built very soon after. And who was the first reverend that Longmeadow hired? It was Stephen Williams. Stephen Williams would stay around Longmeadow and get this church going up to a very high level. He was hired in 1716 to be the first pastor of the church, and he stayed there until 1786. That's 66 years he was the reverend. His father was the Reverend John Williams, and he also was very important in history. He was born in 1664 and died 1729. He also was a reverend for a very long time, and he also was in Deerfield and got captured, and I believe he was released. I think his wife, and thus the mother of Stephen Williams, died during that raid. So this is a very famous family, and his burial is still on there with a beautiful brownstone. It's quite worth the visit if you like Longmeadow history.
And what is the tomb for in the cemetery?
Okay, every cemetery that was a town cemetery needed one of these tombs because during the winter time, when the ground was frozen, you couldn't bury people. And so every cemetery and every community had a town cemetery. So it was like 350 town cemeteries in Massachusetts would need either a tomb or they would need a death house. And most communities that were small or medium sized would have these tombs in the main cemetery. And they would be able to store them. Some were as small as maybe 4 bodies, some 8, some 16. Very big cities like Boston would probably have enormous ones. And there'd pretty much only be one of them. Sometimes in very large geographic size communities you'd have 2 or 3. But Longmeadow had just one. And theirs is in fine shape, and it's quite worth the visit. They were in use almost right from the beginning up to about 1920s, when they finally got implements that could thaw the ground and cut into the ground during the winter time. And thus, these tombs went out of fashion, but a lot of communities kept their tombs. Now, if you don't find a tomb within a given community, it's probably it was been taken down at some point. So Longmeadow is one of the ones that hasn't been taken down, and that's, of course, quite worth the visit. And the way they make almost all these tombs is they make them with a bit of a half dome or some hemispherical look to them. The front would have a locked, heavy plated door to it, and the top would have a description saying the year and the community name and tomb. And then the back and the top would have grass grown on it by design, because that would make it look like it naturally fits into the cemetery's natural look. So Longmeadow is fortunate, and it's well worth the visit, of course, if you ever go to Longmeadow and look at the history.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I'm your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight on the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the neighborhoods of Longmeadow, located in the community of Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Now, what is the arrangement of the neighborhoods of Longmeadow like?
All right. Due to the trolley line going from Springfield north to south and south to north through Longmeadow, on what is now Longmeadow Street, that set up the way the neighborhood was going to be. That trolley line was from the 1898, I believe, and it lasted about 1930. It went all the way to Hartford. But that set up when people wanted to set up in neighborhoods in Longmeadow, that set up how it was going to be. So they had to be next to the trolley line, because if they had cars, it was for one person, and families were larger back then, and they'd like to be in a trolley line nearby. And so the arrangement of the neighborhoods are in horizontal bands east to west off of the north-south line of Longmeadow Street, or the trolley line. And this is true about almost all of them. So Longmeadow is not incredibly developed in its eastern half, but it's in the western half. They're strongly developed all the way through this Springfield Street. And so it's a very unique look to it. There's very few towns in the Connecticut River Valley that are set up this way. And that's because they were so close to Springfield, and people had that opportunity to have a quick out and get home set up. And also, once they're in their home, they can get to the trolley line very quickly.
And why were these neighborhoods formed?
These neighborhoods were formed because Longmeadow used to be almost all farmland before 1900. And then as society changed, and first of all, they didn't need as many farms, and also because people were trying to get out of Springfield, which is already getting to a very high population by 1900. And people wanted to set up a nice houses because they're getting more money. Their middle class of the United States was developing all across the United States, just like in Longmeadow. And so they wanted homes. And they thus had the ability to start forming these locations. And the ones that were closer to Springfield were the ones that formed first along that north-south axis outwards, both to the west and east of that Longmeadow Street. And they formed starting around 1898, and there was a good cluster in the first decade, 1900, and the second cluster, 1910s, and then 1920s. And these neighborhoods would fill in, and then the developers and contractors would come in and start to get another neighborhood going. And each one of these neighborhoods have a lot of kinds of houses inside of them. And but three that always pop up are the bungalows, the neo-colonial, and then the craftsman style.
And really quick, before we continue with our interview, just to fill our listeners in, to find out more information, or if you're interested in signing up for any of his various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can also find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what is the Olmsted influence on these neighborhoods?
All right, the one called Colony Hills, whether it's the portion side of Longmeadow or the portion side of Springfield, and they're adjacent, is absolutely designed by the Olmsted brothers of Brookline, Massachusetts. And they took after their father, who did not like straight lines. They would make curved roads for the neighborhoods and make elevation changes on the landscape itself. So it would go up and down. And this Colony Hills is gorgeous and nice homes on it, of course. Now, there's a developer, Charles Kibbe, who also wanted to develop right below them. And he started what was called the Kibbe Track, or the Colton Place. And he had called the Olmsted brothers and wrote them a couple of times. He never had them design it, but he sent them one of the blueprints from his engineers that the road setup would be like this. And they saw it, they must have talked about it. So it wasn't really truly designed by the Olmsteds, but they acknowledged what he was doing. They probably gave him a little bit of advice. And then the last neighborhood is the Laurel Manor, which is right next to the Longmeadow Golf Country Club. And it's right north of it. And that was also Olmsted design. And Donna Ross, the golf course pro, who designed many beautiful golf courses across the United States, he helped with the design of the golf course and a little bit of the neighborhood. And that interaction, I'm going to cover in another podcast, and definitely in more videos that we're going to have. So the influence of these brothers is great, and there's a few more homes I'll talk about in Longmeadow that had the Olmsted influence too.
And what is the future like for these neighborhoods?
All right, so each of these neighborhoods is quite filled up, so not much is going to change. So they're reaching, a lot of them have passed their 100th anniversary, or will reach it very soon, within 10 years. And most of them are maintained in great condition. Now, there's not much room though, so what will probably happen, they'll keep, and the best thing that could probably happen is just that people keep up on the maintenance of the landscape and of the maintenance of the house itself to make sure that the sub-neighborhoods look very nice. And most of them are quite wonderful. The Colony Hills ones, which is the most special of all, is right next to Forest Park. And any interaction between those two would be great. There used to be more, and they closed the gate, but any interaction in that direction would be wonderful, because having such a big park next to a gorgeous Olmsted neighborhood could always be positive.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And, of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. So check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again.